I am Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and our presenter today is Dr. Richard Haven. He's a Professor Emeritus of Communication, former Interim Dean and Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Communication, and one of the 135 scholars who helped determine the 100 greatest American speeches of the 20th century. Dr. Haven is a regular guest expert on WFAW's Morning Magazine, Wisconsin Public Radio's Ideas Network, and NBC 15 in Madison. Dr. Haven's lecture today is titled, With Malice Toward None, Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address. Welcome.
I hope you're applauding because you're glad to see me and not just because you're in a good mood from celebrating St. Patrick's Day. All right. I didn't wear green today because I thought I should wear blue to remind you who won. It's great to be back, and last week you'll remember we looked at the Gettysburg Address, generally the speech that we regard as the greatest speech in American history. Well, Lincoln would tell you, if he were still around, that he thinks this was his best speech, the second inaugural. And as I mentioned last week, when you walk up those steps and enter the Lincoln Memorial, to one side you see the Gettysburg Address, and to the other side you see his second inaugural address. Those two speeches are certainly his greatest speeches, but he has such a collection of speeches. If we look at Lincoln's speeches, and they are a look at what he thought, and that's why I think studying public speech is so important, we see that he changed as a person. And one of the measurements that I use of whether someone was a great president was how they changed once they became president. Lincoln spoke first as a candidate. Then he spoke as a leader of the Republican Party. Then he spoke as a new president. Then he spoke as a president who was engaged in war. And at the end, he speaks as someone who I think has a vision that was really well ahead of so many others of the time. Lincoln changes. Well, we're going to look at that second inaugural address and take a closer look at what Lincoln said, what difference it made, and how he influenced the future again, even though he would not be around to see the outcome. Now, to do that, and you analyze a speech, you have to set the context. You have to understand what was going on at the time. What was Lincoln facing? We're going to talk about the election of 1864. We're going to look at the impact of the war on the nation at that point, and then we're going to look at the efforts to reunify the nation and how that was becoming the new focus for Abraham Lincoln and for others. Once it became clear that the North would win the war, now what do you do with those Confederates, those states that had seceded? How do you treat them? All right, we'll start with the election of 1864. The first thing I want to tell you is that Lincoln, as he was approaching the election in the summer of 1864, fully expected to lose. The war had not gone that well. There had been a lot of victories for the South early on. There had been Gettysburg in 63 and Vicksburg in 63, but the war continued, and it was so gruesome. And we'll see this in a minute when I show you the impact of the war. But people at the time were pretty unhappy. Lincoln was not a popular president, even with the South gone. And so he expected to lose. He didn't think he would get a second term. Now that would change, of course, but let's take a look at that election. Here are the two candidates, Abraham Lincoln, the sitting president, and George McClellan. Well, who was George McClellan? Yeah, he was the first general. He was one of the generals that Lincoln fired. All right, and George McClellan was only 34 when he assumed the generalship of the Army of the Potomac. He was kind of the boy wonder. And as would become more apparent over time, he was a marvelous parade general. But he was not a good fighting general. He would always complain to Lincoln when Lincoln would be urging him to actually take the army and do something with it, that he needed more troops. He needed more ammunition. The South had many more troops. Now, remember, the population of the United States during the Civil War was about 31 million people. Okay? 20 million of those were in the North. Almost all the industry was in the North. And remember that 4,400,000 in the South were slaves. So the South had only about 8 million people versus 20 million for the North. But here's McClellan always arguing, no, he can't attack because, well, they've got too many soldiers. They must be twice as big as we are. And the opposite, of course, was true. The Army of the Potomac would usually be around 100,000 to 110,000. The Army of Northern Virginia would be around 70,000 to 80,000. But McClellan didn't believe that. He simply was not a general who could take hold. Lincoln once sent him a letter and said, General, if you're not going to use the Army, can I borrow it? At one point, McClellan was really upset with Lincoln because he felt he was interfering with the general who was in charge. And to kind of tweak the president, McClellan, some troops one day came back to him and said, General McClellan, some of our troops have captured some cows. What should we do with them? McClellan sent a telegram to President Lincoln saying, Mr. President, we have captured some cows. What shall we do with them? He was implying that the president was always interfering. President Lincoln immediately shot back in a telegram, milk them. Lincoln had a good sense of humor. Well, Lincoln eventually fired McClellan. McClellan remained a very popular general with the troops. And he remained very popular in the North, and he would become the Democratic Party's candidate for president in 1864. He regarded himself as another Napoleon. In private letters, he wrote to his wife when he was general that he was appointed to save the Union, and that if necessary, he implied that he would become the emperor. So you can see he had a bit of an ego. You might notice his photo, you can barely see it here, but his hand, I think you can see it. Remind you of anybody? Yes, Napoleon. That's General McClellan. All right, so we go into the election now. There were going to be factors that would help Lincoln in the election of 1864. The number one event that helped him was General Sherman taking Atlanta. When General Sherman took Atlanta in, I think, the summer of 1864, then most everyone knew the war was going to go towards the Union, and they would finish it. Up to that point, there was a significant portion of the northern population that wanted to settle. Just settle it now, let the South go, and be done with it. They were called the Peace Democrats. And they were the ones who pushed for McClellan. Once Sherman took Atlanta, though, McClellan even recognized that the war was going to be won by the Union, and he changed his position. And once he changed his position, he lost any difference with Lincoln. That hurt him. Another factor that made a difference in the election of 1864 was that the Democratic Party split. There were the Peace Democrats and the War Democrats. The War Democrats joined the Republicans and formed the National Union Party. And that's what they called themselves. They nominated Lincoln, and so they were working for Lincoln as well. Here's a third factor. Lincoln was a good politician. And while he was leading the efforts as commander-in-chief, he was also taking other steps to keep himself popular in the North. For example, completing the Transcontinental Railroad and rewarding people in northern states with particular things that a president can reward you with, such as free land. And so that helped him as well. And then, being an astute commander-in-chief, he knew that if he could make sure the troops could vote, he would do better, because the troops, the Union Army, wanted to finish the war. And so they arranged to make sure that the Union Army would be able to vote in this election, and that their votes would be sent back and cast according to their states they served in. Those efforts all helped Lincoln to succeed, and in the end, he won easily. So if you look at this graphic in the election of 1864, all the states in red voted for Lincoln. The states in blue, Tennessee was back in the Union by then because they had been captured by the Union. And I think it's Delaware and maybe New Jersey there are the other two. Those were 21 votes for McClellan. That's all he got. And you can see the totals down here, 212 to 21, and 2,220,000 popular vote for Lincoln, 1,800,000 for McClellan, about 55% to 45%. Lincoln had the big victory. And once he had the election won, now he was in a much stronger position to finish the war and to send some messages about what would happen after that war. Now, let's talk about just how bloody this war was. And it was a very bloody affair. It's hard for us to imagine this, so I'll try to give you a comparison to today's population. In 1860 to 1865, the population of the United States was about 31 million. 10% of the population served in the war. Remember, this is both sides. All right, this is 31 million people in the United States of America, so they're both in the Confederate Army and the Union Army. So think about that. 3% of the population are in, or 10% are in the Army. 2% died. All right? That's a fairly high death rate. 620,000 deaths of Americans in the Civil War. Compare that to World War II, 405,000. World War I, 116,000. It still remains the war with the highest death count. Wounded or missing, 410,000. So the total casualties equaled 3% of the population, over 1 million. Now, what would that be like today? 317 million in the United States of America. So if we had a similar war, there would be 32 million combatants. There would be more than 6 million dead and more than 9 million casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. Hard to imagine, isn't it? That's how devastating this war was. That's how overwhelming it was on the population. What a massive amount. And you can imagine if we had it today with a 24-hour news cycle. Oh boy. No, now you can understand why this war wasn't very popular and why, there was a lot of unhappiness in the North because it kept going on, and it was so bloody and so awful, and it looked like it would never end. And so a lot of people were very unhappy, and rightfully so. All right. Then we look at the inaugural address, because the inaugural address brings us up to the concept of reunification. And that would become the next issue. The first issue, as we saw in the Gettysburg Address, was finish the war. And because it had been so bloody, there was a lot of unhappiness about doing that. Once it became clear to Lincoln that now they would be able to finish the war, and by the time he gives the inaugural address, it's just about over. He knows, they just don't know exactly when. He now begins to focus on reunification. How do you bring the nation back together after all of that killing and casualties? And incidentally, remember that one of the developments in the Civil War was the first time most civilized countries had seen total war. And when Sherman marched to the sea, and I incorrectly said last week Sheridan marched to the sea, and I apologize, it was Sherman's march to the sea. He not only is trying to defeat the Southern armies, he's trying to really bring the war to the people of the South. And so, they're leaving little in their path. And part of it was to punish the South for the war. So this has been a very difficult time. All right. So now you'll remember that when we look at a speech, we judge it in a couple of ways. We look at its artistry and its impact. In artistry, we talk about how it's organized. Often most important, the words that are used. Mark Twain once said, the difference between the right word and a word that's almost right is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Words are very powerful. Words can elicit particular emotions. They can have such impact. So we look at words to see what was the speaker saying and how was he saying it. And then, of course, we look at the message. What was Lincoln arguing in that second inaugural address? What was he saying to the whole nation and in some ways to the world? Then we look at the impact and we look at the audiences. And you remember we look at the primary audiences, the secondary audiences, and the historical audience. With this speech, we're especially again interested in the historical audience. Because Lincoln will not live very long after this speech, only about a month and a half, we realize that the impact of the speech changes. If he had lived, there would have been a different impact, I believe, but nonetheless, it's going to affect it. So let's take a look. Like his Gettysburg Address, this speech is organized in past, present, future. It's a logical way to organize, but it's very different. You remember in the Gettysburg Address, he started back with the American Revolution, moved into the war, and then looked at the future, a government of the people. Here, he only looks back 4 years. Now, I got to say something here. You know, this speech occurs on March 4th, 1865. Why did inaugurals occur in March back then? Today, they occur in January, as you might recall. You might ask, why do you want to have a colder day in Washington? And of course, this year it'd be about as cold as January. But why did they occur in March? Why did the Constitution require that? It was a constitutional requirement.
Those that want a chance to get to Washington.
Well, yeah, it were two things. Back in the 18th and 19th century, it took a while to count the vote, all right? And then two, it took a while to notify the candidate and then get the candidate to Washington and everybody else to Washington to have the inauguration and make the transition. You might remember in the movie about Lincoln that we watched last year that Steven Spielberg put together, they focused on the period between the election and the inauguration. And that's when Lincoln pushed to have the 13th Amendment ratified by the Congress. He knew once it was through the Congress, the states would ratify it. One, because the southern states couldn't do anything about it. And so, by the time he gives his speech on March 4th, slavery no longer exists in the Constitution. He knows it's gone. And that was very important. He didn't want that to linger because he was also concerned that there would still be attempts to either argue that after the Civil War, if they did not pass the amendment, since the Emancipation Proclamation was a military order by him, that the slavery would then become legal again when the southern states came back. And he wanted it over. So that was done, and so now he's focusing on a different kind of America. And therefore, you know, when we look at past, present, future, he looks at, first, the past is his inaugural address 4 years before. And he's saying in that, you'll notice, he simply talks about what happened when he gave his first inaugural address. Then he goes to the present, the war, and kind of why the war was happening. And then in the very end paragraph, the most famous part of the speech, he talks about the future. So now we're going to go into that, but let me ask you, we'll test your knowledge here since you got the March 4th. Which president, and I'll tell you, Lincoln's speech here is 700 words. That's pretty brief for an inaugural address. 700 words. We love Lincoln partly because he gave short speeches. All right? But who among the presidents gave the longest speech, and how long was it? Now I'm talking about the inaugural addresses only. Anybody remember? William Henry Harrison in 1841. His was 8,000, I'll get this for you exactly. You can sense 8,460 words. He also died a month later. Unfortunately, it was raining that day and it didn't do his health any good, but 8,000, all right. Which president gave the shortest speech, shortest inaugural? George Washington is correct. Which one of his two speeches? Well, we'll only give you partial credit. The answer is his second was 135 words long. He said, "I'm back, see you later." And we built a monument to him. Notice that. So it's interesting. Most inaugural addresses are longer. Lincoln's is about the third or fourth shortest. FDR had the second shortest, and that was his fourth one when he was actually very ill and would die about a month later. So not surprising he didn't give much of a speech that day. He was about 500 and some words. But I found that interesting about Washington. It fits with his personality so much. Well, in any case, we're looking at the inaugural address and we're talking about past, present, and future. Let's take a look at that style because that's an important part here. And it's in the word choice. And the fact that it's brief, it's concise, that fits with what we saw in the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln is a man of few words, but they're very powerful words. More important, the overriding stylistic feature of this one is it's biblical. Now, Lincoln was not what I'd call a religious president. He didn't wear his religion on his sleeve. We don't really hear much about him attending church. He grew up Baptist, although I don't think he was practicing. He did go to church, but not on a regular basis. And in his first inaugural, he doesn't make a lot of references to religion. In this one, he does. And it's interesting, and it kind of reflects his thinking and also his relationship, I think, to God, how he saw God. And as we look at this speech, it's fascinating to see where his thinking had evolved on why this war happened. And he begins to change. The argument he makes when the war starts is this is to save the Union. It's all about saving the Union. And that was not, he's trying to mislead anybody, he believed that. And that was basically the reason many people volunteered for the Union. Because they believed in the Union, they wanted to save the nation. Southerners said they were fighting for their rights. And probably you could say they were fighting for states' rights. But what Lincoln would see as he looks at this speech is that he felt there was something really that was the root cause. And it became more and more clear. And I think now that the war was almost over, he was ready to say, here's why this happened, and here's why I think God let it happen. We'll examine that in a second. Another factor in this speech, which I think reflects Lincoln, and it reflects the greatness of Lincoln, like the Gettysburg Address, it's inclusive. Here, he does not distinguish between the Northerners who fought and the Southerners who fought. That's very surprising. Because generally, when someone has committed treason and has taken up arms against you, what are you going to do to them? Hang them? Put them in prison? Probably. Punish them in a lot of ways. What's interesting about Lincoln is that he was past that. And he had no desire to punish. He had a great desire to find a way to bring the nation back together. And he begins to point the nation in that direction here. He also heavily influenced Grant. Now, Grant by this time is the commander of the Army, and he's really the one directing what will become the eventual battles with the Army of Northern Virginia. And of course, he's the general present when Lee surrenders, all right, at Appomattox. But now let's go into the message, because we've noted how forgiving and inclusive this is. Let's look at what's said. Why the war happened? Well, Lincoln said the following. He said, while the inaugural address was being delivered, he's talking about his first one, he said, from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. That's what the South wanted. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. That's the past. And notice he placed the blame on the South, not the North. And that was always an argument. Whose fault was it? And Lincoln again comes back to that. He did the same thing in the first inaugural. He made it clear he did not see it as the fault of the North for the war. It was the fault of the South. Now, though, he goes to the present. I should say one more thing. He does mention to the audience, 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves. This was 1861. Not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. He said, these slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Now he comes to talk about that cause in the present. And here is actually, I think, one of the most fascinating parts of this speech. Because Lincoln goes on to say about the Southerners and this war. He said, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged. Sound biblical? Yes. Mind you of Pope Francis? You remember his statement on the plane about homosexuality? He used the same words. Popular section of the Bible. All right. Well, anyway, I went off on another issue there. In any case, it's interesting here because now he moves into why did this war happen? He says, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, his capital, God's appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from these divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. And here's the most interesting part. He says, yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It is the sin of slavery in Lincoln's judgment that caused the war, and that God is punishing the North and the South for the sin. Yes, the South, by that time, were the ones who owned the slaves. But the Northerners had slaves too originally, and would, of course, eventually free slaves. But at the time of the war, of course, only about 1% of the black population lived in the North. Almost all were in the South, and most were slaves. Lincoln, though, puts the blame on both. Notice the inclusiveness. It's not just the South. The North is not let off the hook. Both sides, the whole country is to blame for allowing this sin. And of course, it's the sin of the founding fathers. Because instead of trying to do away with slavery, they compromised and allow it to stay. And so Lincoln reaches the point of saying to his audience that this is a war that came because God was punishing the nation for the sin of slavery. And it was so bloody, so many deaths and casualties because of 250 years of slavery. That's an interesting argument, isn't it? And you see how Lincoln's thinking has changed. I think it does reflect the realization that as much as both sides wanted to say it's not about slavery, in the end it was about slavery. The real reason, it was the issue that North and South could not compromise on anymore. Because the South recognized prior to the war, at least some did, that if they agreed with the North, and the North, remember, had the population and more states voting, to not allow slavery to spread, and that's what Lincoln wanted. He was willing to let slavery stay, but not let it spread into the Western territories. Then, of course, they knew they would eventually be outvoted in the South, and the North could then end slavery. This was their economic system, and they did not want to lose it. Now, many in the North and the West opposed slavery, not because they believed it wrong, but because they didn't like the competition for labor. You can't have one section having free labor, and then others who want to be laborers have to compete against that. And so that was another aspect of this, which is economic. All right, so Lincoln lays it out, and he sees slavery as the cause, Without it, he doesn't believe there would have been a war. And now he believes, in his looking at trying to understand why has this been so awful, that it was God's will to punish the nation and punish them by many dying and being wounded on both sides. Fascinating. Then he moves to the future. And like he did in the Gettysburg Address, it's obviously the end of the speech, but it's also the shortest portion of the speech. Just as he said in the Gettysburg Address that a government of the people, for the people, by the people, shall not perish from the earth, now he talks about what needs to come so that the nation may go forward. And so he had a vision that it would not be a kind of punishment, but rather a kind of reunification. And there we come to the most famous part of his speech. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. He doesn't say, care for the orphans and widows of Union soldiers. All who had borne the battle, with malice toward none. Isn't that fascinating? Here's the man who you would think would be ready to lead the charge to make the South pay. And he's really battling the radical Republicans who are in the Congress, many of them who want to do just that. They want to see some people hang. They want to see the South pay. And Lincoln sets a different tone. And of course, this isn't the first time he has set that tone. In his conversations with Grant, as he and Grant would look at, because he had finally found his general who was willing to carry the war into the South and finish it. It was clear that Grant was on the same page. When Lee surrenders at Appomattox, and I believe that is on April 9th of 1865, Grant meets with him, and they talk for a while. It's the first time they have seen each other since the Mexican War in the 1840s. And they chat. And then Grant gives Lee the terms, and Lee's astonished because he learns that Grant is willing to let the Southern soldiers go home. And they can take with them their horses, mules, and their sidearms. Is that what you do to a vanquished army? You send them home with their arms, with their horses and their mules? Grant felt, and Lincoln reinforced it, that it was very important that they be able to go home, and they needed their horses and mules to plant crops in order to help the South recover. And the sidearm was something that, again, they used because many were rural residents and so on. This astonished Lee, that Grant would be so generous. Most would have expected that Lee would have been arrested. After all, he was a Union general before the war who refused to, the constitutional oath he took, violated it, and then fought against the nation. Most expected him to be in jail. Instead, he gets to go home. In fact, after they had met and the official surrender was signed, Grant rode over to Lee's tent and they chatted for a while later on. Very different. Now, another indication of the tone that Grant set, which reflected Lincoln, was after Lee had met with Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Wilbur McLean's study. And do you all know Wilbur McLean? You remember him? Wilbur's a very special person because the first battle of the Civil War was in another part of Virginia where he lived, and the first shells landed in his front yard. He was so disgusted by that, he moved to Appomattox Courthouse, and it would be his parlor where the war would end. So he used to say, the war began in my front yard and ended in my parlor. Interesting piece of trivia. On the day that Lee's troops from the Army of Northern Virginia marched in to the courthouse to surrender, all right, they laid down some of their swords, some of their arms, and so on. The general commanding the northern troops was Joshua Lawrence. Remember, he's my favorite soldier. He was a general by then. He's the professor of rhetoric. And he shocked everyone when he called his troops to attention and they saluted General Lee, a sign of respect. And it was later written how much Lee appreciated that and how impressed he was at the gentlemanly nature of General Chamberlain and General Grant. And General Lee would never, in his presence after the end of the war, tolerate any negative comments about Grant in the South. But in any case, that set the tone. And Lee said to Grant, incidentally, that he thought what Grant did would help to reunify the nation because it left a much better feeling than what others would have done to those soldiers. Many of them would have been arrested, tried for treason, and they would have hung them. So rather amazing. We certainly don't see that happening today, do we? That's not how most governments respond to people who commit treason or try to overthrow the government or to secede from the government. But in any case, that's one of the more interesting aspects here. So Grant was on the same page with Lincoln, and Lincoln appreciated how Grant treated Lee and then how that affected the South in the future. Most of the Southern armies within weeks surrendered because once Lee surrendered, they knew it was over. And so there was a few small battles, but essentially the war was done. Unfortunately, as we know, a few days later, Lincoln was assassinated. And that changed everything. Because now, with Johnson assuming the presidency, and he was from Tennessee, he did not have the kind of support Lincoln had or the ability to guide policy. Those who were wishing to be much more harsh with the South became much more powerful and would affect Reconstruction in a way that was less helpful, we think, than what Lincoln would have done. But nonetheless, in that speech, he pointed the nation in the right direction. A direction that would show malice toward none and would show a way to reunify without placing too great a burden on those in the South. Their burden was going to be pretty heavy because remember, so much of the area had been destroyed. So in any case, that's the second inaugural address. Now, as we've done in the past, I want to take you, incidentally, I want to take right back here. Can you see this photo? That's from the inauguration. And if you can see, there are a group of troops standing at attention. If you can see closer, they are African American troops. They're blacks. And I wanted to point it out to you because you notice they've got their rifles. They're right there. They're still in the Army, and they're at the inauguration. One of the keys to winning the war for the North was that they included blacks in the Army. Came after the Emancipation Proclamation. Most of them were slaves who then joined the Union Army. By the end of the war, 178,000 blacks were in the Army. 19,000 were in the Navy. 68,000 suffered casualties. 10,000 died. Now remember, like the white troops, the majority died of disease, but at least a couple thousand died of wounds in battle. They were very active in the war, and they really added to the ability of the North to continue to overwhelm the South. They were also treated much more harshly by the South when they were captured than were white troops. So they saw that. But notice their willingness to serve. They understood what was happening for them, and they were willing to support it. So they were a significant proportion given their population. Remember, only about 1% of the 4.4 million lived in the North. These are slaves who are coming to join the Union Army. The South, at the end, tried to recruit slaves to fight for them. Well, you can imagine how they might have felt. And in the end, there were a few, but not very many, a handful who actually fought. Throughout most of the war, the South would never have armed the slaves for obvious reasons. It didn't make a lot of sense. All right, now, I want to take you back before we do questions and show you another piece of Ken Burns. This is a look at the inaugural address, and you'll see some photos, and here are a few of the words spoken that day. It's a fascinating clip, and I love and I don't love it. I'm fascinated by the fact that Booth was there and how easy it was for someone armed to be that close to the president. It would take until really, I think, the 1930s before the country would begin to really make it more difficult for people to have access to the president when they're armed. The same thing would happen to two other presidents who would be assassinated, McKinley in 1901 and before him, the president who was assassinated, I think, in 1880. They're out walking around and someone can just walk up to them and shoot them. So it was that way at that time. Well, that's the second inaugural address. The impact was powerful. Clearly, Lincoln had articulated a message on the immediate audience that was well fed. He was a popular president now, easily won re-election, and he had set the tone for what he thought would become the next part of this long struggle. And one has to believe that if he had lived, the South would have benefited. It's one of the ironies of the assassination, because by killing him, more radical leaders emerge who then have more power and will punish the South much more, I think, than Lincoln would have. And I think that's one of the great ironies here. But in these words, we find, again, why Lincoln was so special and why, and we have to wonder why he was able to grow and change and deal with all of this and still come to these words after all that had happened. And I think that's one of the reasons I regard him as our greatest president. No president's faced anything like that. And to face it the way he did, and then to say what he says in the Gettysburg Address, and then to say what he says in the second inaugural, is amazing. And he leaves a great image for us, a great message for us about how we as a nation should be toward those we disagree with, for those who may hate us. And I think in many ways, we have learned so much from Lincoln over the ages. So with that in mind, the historical audience is the most influenced audience by this speech. It is the other speech of Lincoln that we so often quote, if nothing else but to say with malice toward none. And it is the other speech that I think leaves such an indelible mark in our minds and in our nation's memory about Abraham Lincoln. With that in mind, I'll be glad to take questions and talk about this great speech a bit more.
Questions? Okay.
Well,
We'll have you use the
Oh.
microphone. Thank you.
okay, I was just going to use my teacher voice, but that's fine. With the Gettysburg Address, there are all these little anecdotes about writing it on an envelope and all that sort of thing. What about with this one? Planned well ahead, last minute? What do you know about the whole process?
Well, first of all, with the Gettysburg Address, that was also planned well ahead. The notion that Lincoln wrote it quickly is not correct. He really would spend a lot of time. He would often write notes and stick them in a desk drawer in the White House as he would think of things, and then he'd come back to them later. But both of these messages were well prepared, and they reflected his emerging thinking of the time. With Gettysburg, he was looking for a place where he could say what he said. And the Gettysburg event gave him that chance. So he knew he had it, now he set it up to fit that occasion. Obviously, with the second inaugural being re-elected in November, and then this occurs in March, he had a lot of time. And yes, he took quite a bit of time. And it again reflected his thinking about the war and why it happened. Now, he would also show a speech like this to his aides, most notably Seward. And Seward made some changes that he suggested. They were not substantive changes in the ideas, but in the exact wording. So he would have some assistance as well. That was not uncommon at the time. It wasn't functioning as a speechwriter, but he would show it to others and get some feedback. So yes, he took a lot of time, very carefully crafted, and very clear that he understood where they were at that moment, that the war was over for all intents and purposes, and now was time to focus on what came next. I find that most surprising is what he finally decided about the reason for the war happening. He places it squarely on slavery, and it's the sin of the nation. not the sin of the South, but the sin of the nation, and that they all had to pay. And I think that finally made some sense to him, because he couldn't comprehend, nor could many others, why it had to be so bad. Why was it so bloody? Now he had a reason. And let's remember that the dominant book of the 19th century in American homes was the Bible. Many homes had no other book. And Lincoln, although he was a voracious reader, he read Shakespeare, he read other great books, he read the Bible. And when he decided to use the Bible in this speech, he was speaking to an audience that was very familiar with the Bible. And that was not a surprise. It was more a surprise that Lincoln focused so much on the biblical theme. Other questions?
There you go.
Have any historians ever found anything in writing by Lincoln that gave some direction for what he was thinking about Reconstruction?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously this speech gives some indication. His communications with Grant gave a good indication of what he expected in terms of how they would treat the South in surrender. So those are the two best ones I'm aware of. I suspect there are probably others, especially in letters he wrote, but I'm aware of those.
On the ability of Lincoln to...
Peter, let's have you do it again there just so we get you on the mic.
Dick, would you comment on the ability of Lincoln to work with different kinds of people and work for success in terms of their differences?
You bet. And one of the things that is often overlooked, and I thought the movie Lincoln helped us to understand it, is that Lincoln was a brilliant politician. And today the term politician is thought of negatively. That's too bad, because it's not a negative term, it's a descriptive term. And for our system to work, politicians must exist. And for politicians to succeed, they must compromise. And so being a good politician means you learn how to work government. Well, Lincoln was a very good politician, and one of the things he did was to put together a kind of a unified cabinet. And you remember in the great work, Team of Rivals, that focuses on how he would appoint those who were convinced that they should have been the president and not him, that they were smarter than he was, certainly better looking, and therefore they thought superior. And yet Lincoln was able to kind of swallow some of their criticism and bring them in and create a cabinet that was much more effective and successful in 1861. And then by 1864, of course, and 65, they are realizing just how brilliant Lincoln was. And now they recognized his greatness and what he had been able to do. He was able to work with them to, in a sense, let them make fun of him, and yet go on and get them to do what he wanted them to do. So yes, he was very good, I think. And even, again, working with those who were opposed to him, even in the South. Other questions?
Up for here.
Can you tell us how the South reacted to his speech?
To some extent, we know the South's reaction to the Gettysburg Address was very negative. And they were critical of it. That's not surprising. I would expect that, again, the South was critical of Lincoln's inauguration, but by that point, they really weren't focused much on it. The Confederacy was crumbling, and most of the focuses there was the radicals were still hoping they could hold out and fight longer. And they were very upset with Lee for surrendering because they figured that would end it, and they wanted Lee to keep on fighting. So I think the focus had changed away from that and not really much on Lincoln. And for a long time the South, many in the South, not all, many in the South refused to see Lincoln as a great president. They just didn't think he made the difference. It wasn't, what's the big deal about Lincoln? And so there's a different perspective there for obvious reasons. But I think we know that over time, most historians. Shelby Foote, who's a great Southern historian, often quoted in Ken Burns, is very clear in his admiration for Lincoln and recognized the greatness of Lincoln. But I suspect the South wasn't real happy with the speech.
Did you have a question?
With the Civil War and slavery here, did that have any impact on slavery in other countries? Or are we the only country that really had slavery?
No, we're not the only country that had slavery. And, to the extent, Europe had done away with slavery before the United States does away with it in 1865. So of those nations, that I suspect there was still slavery in some parts of South America or in the Caribbean areas and so on. And certainly, remember, there was slavery in Africa. And I suspect there still is in some areas. But for the most part, we were the last of the nations that we would often interact with. And it was pretty well on its way out as a result. Other questions?
Who was the president of Mexico that Lincoln was so close to that they really influenced each other's thinking?
That I can't tell you. I'm not sure on the status of Mexico at that point in relation to this.
There was a
Don't see much about Mexico within my readings about the Civil War.
Okay.
One more little piece of trivia which I find fascinating, and that is that at Appomattox, when Lee surrendered, one of the aides to General Grant was an officer who happened to be an American Indian. And he was the officer who copied down the terms of the treaty and then presented them to Lee to sign. And Lee was introduced to him, learned that he was an American Indian, and said offhandedly to Grant, well, at least there's one Native American here today. And I think he was Colonel Parker, but in any case, I might get the name right. He said back to Lee, sir, we are all Americans. That's kind of interesting. That reflected again the uniqueness of the Northern Union Army, because it was made up of people from so many different backgrounds who spoke different languages and yet all fought for union. That was an unusual army.
Okay, with that, I'd like to make a couple quick announcements, and then perhaps Dr. Haven could stay if anyone has additional questions.
Glad to.
I just want to point out that of the three of the questions that were asked here today, we still have 3 lectures that will cover those topics: Reconstruction, Lincoln and Native Americans, and forced labor that still exists. So we still have 3 lectures in the series that are going to address those questions specifically. And also, just to point out, I have Taps and Tony here with me today. They make videos of every lecture, including Dr. Haven's from today and from last week. They're excellent videos, very easy to follow and to look back on what was said here today and then all the way back to 2007. So I encourage you to go on our website and check them out if maybe some information went too fast today or if you missed Dr. Haven from last week. So for today, though, let's go ahead and thank Dr. Haven for his excellent lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.